Most people think letting go is just about moving on, getting over it, blocking, deleting, pretending you're fine. But spiritually, it's way deeper than that. When you finally decide to let someone go, really let go, it's like your soul hits a reset button. You don't just lose a person, you start to lose the version of yourself that existed with them. Letting go isn't just hard, it's disorienting. People don't talk enough about that. One minute, you're clinging to the familiar chaos of someone who made you feel seen. The next, you're staring at silence that feels heavier than their absence. It's not just a breakup, it's a full-body spiritual shift. That can feel like your whole identity is crumbling. And honestly, in a way, it is. It feels like a collapse, not just emotionally but spiritually. You're watching a self die, a self built on survival, attachment, and the illusion that your peace depended on another person staying. That illusion held you together. Now it's falling apart, and you're left to face what's real without it. Carl Jung, the visionary who transformed modern psychology, talked about this. He believed that what we call letting go is often the start of something much bigger, the beginning of becoming who you really are, outside of the roles, the neediness, the expectations. But that transformation, it doesn't feel like growth at first. It feels like falling apart. But here's what no one tells you. Before you meet that deeper self, you have to sit in the wreckage of who you no longer are. And in that silence, something ancient stirs. When someone leaves your life, or when you finally let them go, it doesn't just create space. It stirs up shadows. Not the dramatic kind from horror movies, but the kind that lives quietly in your everyday patterns, your reactions, your silence. It's what you've avoided seeing in yourself, now rising to the surface without warning. You start to realize how much of yourself you gave up to keep the connection. You notice how often you stayed quiet to avoid conflict, how easily you accepted things that didn't feel right, how quickly you dismissed your own needs. These behaviors weren't obvious before. Now they're impossible to ignore. Without the distraction of the other person, your attention turns inward. The pain isn't just about the relationship ending, it's about the awareness that follows. You begin to understand that much of what hurt wasn't just what they did, it was what you allowed, justified, or stayed silent about. There is a kind of discomfort that shows up when the patterns become visible. You see how long you've been operating from fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of not being enough, fear of losing someone even when they weren't giving you what you needed. Letting go forces those fears into focus. This part of the process is difficult because it's honest. It doesn't offer easy answers or quick relief. It shows you the truth about how you've been relating to love, attachment, and self-worth. That truth can feel heavy, but it's also necessary. Avoiding it only leads back to the same cycles. Letting go exposes what was hidden under the need to be chosen. When the other person is no longer there to validate or reject you, you are left with your own reflection, and it's not always easy to face. But avoiding it only delays the work your healing requires. What rises now is personal. It's not about the other person anymore, it's about your own patterns, choices, and beliefs. The silence that used to feel empty starts to reveal information. You begin to see how you've been shaped by past experiences, and how that shaped the way you showed up in this connection. This awareness doesn't fix everything, but it shows you where to look. And once you've seen it, change is no longer optional. The only way forward is through a deeper level of honesty with yourself. Letting go does something strange. It doesn't just change how a person feels, it changes who they believe they are. When someone becomes part of a daily routine, an emotional pattern, or a sense of meaning, the ego builds around it. It adapts, shapes itself, and takes on a role that fits the connection. That role becomes familiar, predictable. even comforting in its own way. Once the relationship ends, that structure begins to fall. What held the sense of self together no longer applies. The person isn't just gone. The version of the self that existed in that connection begins to disappear too. This creates confusion, not just about the past, but about identity. The individual starts to question what parts of them were real and what parts were just responses to the other person's presence. Emotional habits don't stop immediately. They echo. And in the absence of the one they were shaped around, those habits begin to feel empty. This emptiness is not a failure, it's a break in the illusion. When the ego loses its frame of reference, it doesn't know where to go next. It resists the loss. It wants to rebuild quickly, find something or someone new to cling to. But the pause that follows is necessary. Spiritually, this pause is powerful. It holds the space where transformation begins, not through effort, but through removal. When the roles fall away, something deeper starts to emerge. The person is no longer playing a part. They are left with what's underneath. This isn't comfortable. The mind looks for identity. It searches for labels, for direction, for familiar ground. But letting go creates a kind of internal silence where none of that exists yet. The old definitions no longer fit, and the new ones haven't formed. Some call this a loss of self, but it's more accurate to say that what's being lost is the constructed self, the one that depended on someone else to feel real. There's a moment in this process when the individual realizes they can't go back to who they were. That version no longer exists. And forward? Forward is unclear. But something is already changing. Slowly, quietly, without needing to be named. The collapse of ego isn't destruction. It's exposure. And what comes next depends on what is allowed to remain in the silence. After the break, there's a drop. Not always visible from the outside, but internally, something shifts. This is the stage where emotional order starts to collapse. What made sense no longer applies. The person may still be gone, but the impact of their absence deepens, not just in thought, but in the body. The nervous system stays alert, waiting for a message that won't come. Appetite changes, sleep feels different, concentration slips, a low-grade instability that touches everything. People call it sadness or grief, but it's more than that. It's a full system response to emotional withdrawal. The descent doesn't follow a timeline, it moves in waves. One moment feels manageable, the next is a flood of memories, questions, regrets. There is no logic to it, only intensity and silence. This is often the moment when a person reaches for something, anything to make it stop. A distraction, a substitute, a temporary fix. But nothing really works because the pain isn't shallow. It's not a surface wound, it's a deeper unraveling. Spiritually, this is a confrontation. Without the other person in the picture, all the energy that once moved outward turns inward. There's no one to chase, no one to prove anything to. Only the raw reality of what's left behind. And what's left is heavy. Sometimes it shows up as guilt, sometimes as shame, sometimes as the fear that none of it meant anything. The mind searches for resolution, but there isn't one yet. Just a pull downward towards something that hasn't revealed itself. People mistake this phase for failure. They think they're going backwards. But what's actually happening is a stripping away. The emotional layers that once protected the deeper self are falling off. And what's underneath hasn't learned how to stand alone. This isn't a breakdown. It's a process of removal. The outer identity is losing its grip, and the inner world is being forced to reorganize. That reorganization can't be rushed. It demands space, stillness, and a kind of honesty that feels uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it's real. The descent doesn't offer answers. It offers exposure. And when the dust settles, what's revealed isn't a solution. It's a starting point. When a connection ends, the reflection it provided disappears too. The person is no longer there to affirm, react, or validate. Without that mirror, identity starts to shift. What once felt stable becomes uncertain. Emotional cues vanish. The image of the self, once shaped around someone else, starts to fall apart. And what's left is raw awareness. That awareness reveals how much of the connection was never really about the other person. It was about what they reflected back. The longing to be enough, the fear of being abandoned, the need to be seen, even in the wrong light. Letting go breaks the illusion. The story stops repeating, and suddenly the projections return to their source. It's not just uncomfortable, it's disruptive. Because now, the responsibility isn't on them, it's back on the one who gave it away. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." For many, that unconscious was hiding inside the relationship, camouflaged as love, attachment, chemistry. Letting go exposes it. What felt like connection often masked avoidance. Avoidance of old pain, avoidance of self. Now, that avoidance has nowhere else to go. The silence begins to speak. It points to the roles that were played: caregiver, fixer, chaser, savior. Roles that never came from truth, but from fear. And with the mirror gone, those roles collapse. This collapse can feel like identity loss, but it's not a loss, it's a return. A slow peeling back of who was never truly there. And underneath, something else waits. Not louder than the pain, just clearer than the confusion. And once it starts to surface, it becomes harder to go back to pretending. After the emotional patterns start breaking down, something quieter begins to take shape. It doesn't come with confidence or clarity. It comes with unfamiliarity. The attachment that once defined the day-to-day is no longer present. The emotional reflexes that guided behavior lose direction. What used to be automatic now pauses. Responses feel slower. Reactions don't land the same way. What's forming here isn't an improved version of the self. It's an unfiltered one. There is no audience to impress, no emotional cycle to maintain. The person is left with choices that feel clean, but strange. The need to be affirmed starts to weaken. Validation isn't as addictive, silence isn't as threatening. There's still discomfort, but it's not ruled by panic. It exists, and it passes. This is where individuation begins. Not in a dramatic breakthrough, but in subtle separation from emotional habits that were once constant. The behavior shifts, not out of control, but out of awareness. There's more observation, more internal scanning, noticing thoughts before attaching to them, watching emotions without being controlled by them. The space between reaction and response starts to grow. These aren't personality changes. They're signals of self-recognition. Without a relationship shaping identity, there's room for choice. Small, often quiet, but meaningful. The person starts adjusting their surroundings, creating boundaries where none existed before, saying no where there used to be automatic yes, leaving situations that once felt familiar but no longer feel right. It's not a confident process. Doubt still lingers. The old self still tries to return. The patterns aren't fully gone. They're just easier to spot. And that awareness becomes a tool. This stage often includes a need for solitude, not isolation, but separation from noise. The person becomes more selective with where they invest energy. What used to feel urgent no longer demands the same attention. There's more time spent being still, more decisions made without over-explaining. a stronger connection to what feels real, not what looks acceptable. The changes aren't loud. They don't need to be. They show up in how the person carries themselves when no one is watching. Individuation isn't a reward for surviving pain. It's what naturally forms when the person no longer builds identity around who stayed or who left. In this phase, nothing has to be proven, and that is what makes it stable. Real change doesn't begin when pain ends. It begins when pain starts making sense. Everything that felt like chaos starts revealing its pattern, not because the pain disappears, but because the person is no longer trapped inside it. There's distance now, enough to see what used to control every emotional response. This is where the shift begins, not in the mind, but in the body. Breathing feels different. Thoughts aren't racing in loops. There's a little more room to pause, and that pause is powerful. What used to trigger collapse now brings reflection. The same situations might show up, but the reaction is different. Less urgency, more clarity, more self-respect. That's the beginning of emotional transformation. Not pretending to be healed, just responding from a different place. This is the process people rarely talk about. The invisible changes that show up before the visible ones. Choosing to walk away from a familiar conflict. Saying no without guilt. Taking space without fear of abandonment. These aren't small wins. They're turning points. Each decision creates heat. Each act of self-respect turns pain into power. That's the alchemy. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. A shift from survival to choice. And slowly the old version of the self, the one who begged to be chosen, who tolerated emotional confusion, starts to fade. Not because they were weak, but because they've been outgrown. Now comes the rebuild, grounded in truth, moved by integrity, guided by a quieter, steadier voice inside. The outside world may not notice the difference right away, but internally, everything has changed. There's a deeper calm, not silence, not numbness, just stability. And that stability opens doors that pain used to keep shut. This is what spiritual evolution feels like. Not distant, not abstract, just honest. And the more that clarity settles in, the harder it becomes to return to what once felt normal. Because what's coming next doesn't match who they used to be. Healing isn't about going back to who someone used to be. It's about becoming someone they've never had the space to become. Once the pain clears, even slightly, the landscape starts to change. The choices are different. The standards rise. And what used to feel acceptable now feels out of place. It's not about pretending the past didn't matter. It did. It shaped everything. But it doesn't get to dictate what happens next. This phase brings a kind of strength that isn't loud. There's no need to prove anything. The person stops chasing closure, stops defending their side of the story, stops waiting for the apology that may never come. Instead, the focus turns inward and forward. The connection to self becomes clearer, not perfect, not constant, but steady enough to build on. The decisions made now come from alignment, not reaction. What was once broken starts to feel useful. Not because it's forgotten, but because it's been understood. The person isn't the same, and that's the point. Something new has taken shape. Not a performance, not a mask. A real grounded identity that doesn't need external permission to exist. But even in this clarity, a question lingers, one that only the next step can answer. Letting go changes people, not just emotionally, spiritually. It's one of the few decisions that doesn't just remove someone from your life, it removes layers from your identity, layers that were shaped around fear, attachment, and the need to be understood by someone who couldn't meet you where you were. Most don't realize what's actually happening. From the outside, it looks like a breakup, a separation, a personal shift. But underneath, a deeper process has already started. This is a spiritual initiation, one that doesn't begin with clarity. It begins with collapse. It removes what's no longer aligned and forces the person to rebuild without shortcuts. That's what makes it powerful and hard to explain. There's no ceremony, no celebration, just a quiet moment when something inside says, "I can't live like this anymore." And that moment rewrites everything. The person who comes out the other side is not who they were. Not because they changed everything, but because they stopped pretending. The old version was built for survival. This one is built for truth. Letting go is the test. Staying gone is the transformation. It's not about getting back to peace. It's about becoming someone who no longer negotiates their worth to feel loved. The initiation isn't marked by closure. It's marked by ownership. And once that shift happens, there's no return to who they used to be. If this spoke to something in you, something you felt but couldn't explain, consider subscribing. This space is for people who are ready to grow through what they've been through. And if this helped, feel free to leave a super thanks. It goes a long way in keeping this message alive. Thank you for watching.